Okay, everybody, it's time for session 5A. Again, you're joining the 15th annual MIT CDOIQ Symposium. Some of us have been around this rodeo for a long time, and privacy analytics is absolutely one of our standard pillars in here. Luke and Sarah have put together a terrific program here for you, so I'll introduce everybody on the panel real quickly. Luke Arbuckle carries the title Chief Methodologist for Privacy Analytics, and of course you've seen Sarah on the commercials. She is the general manager. They've invited two of their colleagues, Kaul, who is the interim chief data officer at Bristol Myers Squibb, but she also has some finance background that she said she may be talking to us a little bit about here as well. And talk about a big job. Joy Bonaguro is the chief data officer for the state of California. Luke, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for assembling such a wonderful group for us.
Thank you. I'm actually going to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to do the introductions.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you. Luke and I have had the opportunity over the past few months to facilitate several panels, roundtables, and even polls with chief data officers and data leaders. And the discussions and perspectives in all of these different sessions have really been the inspiration for today's Choose Your Own Adventure session. We're really looking at the opposing forces at play that CDOs really need to manage and balance on a day-to-day basis with all of the different hats that they wear. So what we're going to be doing, we've introduced Kamayini and Joy. Both of our data executives today are going to be playing the role of a chief data officer in this Choose Your Own Adventure session. Luke and I will be facilitating as board members of a new venture that's a spin-off of a larger company. And with the new spin-off, we as board members want to be speaking to the CDO about the data sharing strategy. Because this is a new venture and the CDO role is a new position within the organization, it's a new team and a new opportunity to really shape the data sharing strategy and the narrative around data sharing. One key thing for today's story is that our data sharing theme is key because this is considered to be a core strategic capability for the new company and fundamental to the reason for creating the chief data officer role. So with Luke and I playing the role of board members and Joy and Kamayini sharing the role of the chief data officer, you as the audience today are also going to play a very key role in shaping where this story goes. There are going to be some key decision points that you're going to be able to weigh in on that will determine what scenario Joy and Kamayini are going to need to respond to. And because both are playing the role of a single chief data officer, whatever one decides to do, the other is going to need to be able to follow. So we're going to try to have some fun today, really looking forward to see what you as the audience want to see in terms of the scenarios that play out. There is no right answer. This is really about exploring those opposing forces at play. And I'll hand it to Luke. Luke, maybe you can share a little bit more about how this story is going to play out.
Classic mistake. I'm on mute. We have a bit of a thunderstorm going on in the background, so you'll apologize if you hear some some action going on behind me. I don't know what that is. Okay, so the basic idea for those who aren't familiar with this, a choose your own adventure story, is that it's exactly as Sarah described. You get to a certain point in a story and there are decision points. And so we're forcing our CDOs into these, let's call them false dichotomies. They have to make a choice and go down a certain path, except in this case, it's you as the audience that actually get to pick the path they take. So we're asking not that we're gonna ask you at some point to make a decision, and we're gonna ask you to use the chat function. If you go on the right-hand side of Whova or Whova, whatever it's called, you'll see there's a tab there for chat. You can just type in there whatever the decision point is, just put in the word that we ask of the two. but you're not picking the best answer, right? The idea here is to pick something that speaks to you. Maybe you're in a certain position, it kind of resonates with what you're currently dealing with, some struggles you're having, and our very experienced CDOs here are going to, navigate that based on the circumstances that you're imposing on them in a sense. So you're picking one of these two choices, and they're going to fit within their storyline to try and find the best path forward. And that's the basic idea. Of course, if you're familiar with this idea of a choose your own adventure story, there's potentially sometimes you get to a point and you've made a wrong decision and you get to the end and the story's over. So we reserve the right to kind of play that role and go, you know what, let's go back a step. That was really interesting, but we think we'd like to hear a different path. Now, we're not saying we're going to do that because this is all being done live. It's very dynamic, but we may decide to go back a step and ask our CDOs, what would they do differently if we went down this certain path and change the story up a little bit. But we do have a limited amount of time, of course, so we're going to only pick a few of these decision points and see how that plays out. And with that, I'll pass it back on to Sarah to get the ball rolling, basically.
Okay, fantastic. So for everybody in the audience, we're going to actually start this out with a key decision that's going to introduce the conversation that we board members have with our CDO today. And the question for you, audience, you can put the answer into the chat window of Whova, is whether our CDO today is going to report within the organization through IT, through the CIO, or through functional business area, through another CXO. So your options to vote in the chat window are through IT or functional area. And we're going to look and see what the predominant answer here is as to what you want to see.
Now, of course, if people don't add to the chat, then Sarah and I get to be a little bit, have a little more decision-making power as board members, and we'll just pick. So I'm not seeing any messages coming in. I don't know about anyone else. I don't know if it's my Whova or not, but.
I'm not seeing any either through the Whova.
Okay. So how about, just to keep things moving, we'll pick, and I'm going to pick something just because I know it'll be a little more fun. Let's go with the IT role. so do we see Joy already reacting? So I'll let you kick it off, Sarah, but let's go with the IT one. I think that'll be more interesting.
Okay, fantastic. So, all right, let's kick this off. Question for Joy. Joy, what's your vision for data sharing within the organization in light of the reporting structure being through IT?
Sure. Thank you all for having me. So yeah, I reacted because I sort of teasingly joke. I'm occasionally approached about CDO roles, and every time they're in the IT shop, I say, sorry, I'm not interested. In part because I think the CDO role is fundamentally a change management role, and it's a culture role. It's less of a technology problem. And so, that being said, if I found myself stuck in the IT shop, I would start by building on an analogy that I developed for the state of California called the data gym. And the data gym analogy is based on trying to clarify what I see as sort of confusion about the roles of IT in data teams and in the role of the business. And I would really use this to sort of align the responsibilities, not only around data sharing, but analytics in general. And the way the data gym works is it's this. IT shops are responsible for sort of buying the equipment, renting the gym space, making sure, it's well maintained. But it's really data teams' jobs. They're like the trainers at the gym, right? They help you, figure out how to use the equipment, what sequences to put on, how to target your trouble spots. But ultimately, it's really business that needs to show up and decide to get in shape. And so even if I found myself in the IT shop, I think I found CDOs that are based in the IT shop tend to focus more on the technological choices around data. And focusing on the supply side of data and not as much on the demand. However, I would still sneak in how to cultivate good demand and really sit the ultimate responsibility for data-led initiatives with the business side.
Thank you, Joy. And so I'm a little bit curious about this gym analogy, what you've introduced, where it's really, the business that comes to get into shape. So Kamayini, maybe you can walk me through, how do you see ensuring alignment between these two, the IT that's, responsible for renting the gym and having the equipment, and the business coming in? How over the longer term will both remain aligned in your view?
I think it's a fair corollary question, right? And unlike Joy, I actually am not opposed to the idea of reporting, a CDO reporting through a CIO or a CTO or a CDIO, Digital and Information Officer. In fact, believe it or not, that's become quite a popular flavor of configuring a CDO, CDAO remit in multiple industries, including financial services. Not that the verdict's settled in any industry, but having said that, I've also had the good fortune or the misfortune of almost always reporting through the CIO or the Chief Technology and Operations Officer for the company in two industry contexts, both healthcare as well as in financial services. So that said, to go back to your question, Sarah, of how do you ensure that alignment? Look, agnostic of where you roll in, I think the data person of an organization needs to speak business value while speaking data and technology enablement all at the same time. So the two ways I've seen this come about as a fruitful co-traveling of both those agendas of business value and technology enabling business value is typically to have a CDO like Joy and I make sure that we enlist both an internal enterprise set of constituents, whether these are business unit P&L leaders or they're functional business unit orientation. Companies organized two different ways, typically P&L or functional business units. Bring them into making a commitment to how data can move the needle either on their revenue line or in the way that they operate today, right? And this is where I think the CDO is a change agent. And this is where I think Joy and my philosophy aligns, is this, it's about change management. It's about the human change management. And this is where if you build that advisory board, even if you find yourself stuck in a CIO or a CDIO type of construct reporting through a technology head of an organization, that advisory board becomes that glue on, if you will, that makes sure that the technology agenda is responding from a data enablement lens to where the business's focus, priorities, competitive differentiators are striving to go. That said, I think I'll wrap this with that it really doesn't matter where you report. It's the person you place in the job and how much of a change agent, the individual that's tasked with the CDO role, that's more important. And how you enable sort of this enterprise-wide accountability, facilitate dialogue, and gain commitment, that's more important. Sarah, I'll turn it back to you if there's another pivot that seems to be emerging from our audience poll.
Thank you, Kamayini. So one of the big focus areas for us obviously here is data sharing. I wonder, Luke, if we should explore data sharing and the direction for the company.
Yeah, and I'll just repeat something we said earlier because there was some delay in the live feed, and I just want to make sure that people are watching now actually understand the premise a little bit. So this is a choose your own adventure story. So what we're asking the audience is in the chat, we're going to monitor the chat. We're going to give you an option to pick a decision point, essentially, which direction we're going to take the conversation with Joy and Kamayini. So we've just talked about where the reporting structure is, and we talked about specifically reporting into the IT function to see how that would shape the narrative. And the idea here is that you have to make a choice, right? We have to make a choice between two things, and it's just to get the dialogue going. So as Sarah said, now let's look at, this is a venture where we're looking at this new venture company, or this new spin-off company. And the key focus here is data sharing. So the question now we ask of the audience is, Do you want the focus to be on developing internal data sharing, strengthening that side? Again, they can only pick one, or external data sharing, which can be partnerships with other organizations, access to data. It could be open data. We haven't defined this in any particular field. So it could be government, it could be health, where there's perhaps clinical trials transparency. So where would the audience like to pick? So pick either, choose one of two words, internal or external, and that will drive the conversation forward. So the live is working now, which is good. So if we can get some people to just add in the chat, which direction do you want it to go? Do you want us to focus on the CDO building out the internal data sharing capacity? So breaking down silos, for example, getting people access to data to innovate internally, or do you want to focus on partnerships? Again, the purpose of this is that we've got this spin-off company where the focus is on data.
We've got an even split right now. So
Yeah.
does anybody want to
Yeah,
be
exactly.
a tiebreaker?
We got one more in the
Otherwise,
chat.
Luke and I.
External, interesting. Okay, so we'll start with external. So the question then, since Kamayini just headed in, we'll jump to Joy again. So Joy, the focus here is going to be on external. We decided as an organization, as a spinoff, that's where we want to focus our attention. So what's your plan? What do you think is a good strategy to move into this external data sharing side of the house?
Sure, and I'll take it from the lens of a government sector, but as well as a private sector around cybersecurity, since I have some background there as well. So on the government side of things, there was a big movement around what was called open data. So the proactive publication of machine readable data. And when I joined San Francisco as the chief data officer there, our sort of open data, I talk about these sort of 5 stages of open data maturity. There's the like executive edict, we shall share data, right? And then there was, the publishing scramble, and people were like, oh, let's throw up data, with not a lot of attention paid to quality, consistency, data pipelines, automation, this kind of thing. And then we moved into the period of stagnation, where just the whole program sort of had lost its legs. And so I considered myself as coming into as the resource reckoning. And based on that experience, how I would start it from scratch is one, to Kamayini's point, sussing out your stakeholders and who needs what and what people are thinking about. So first, doing an internal understanding and analysis of what are the business drivers of external data sharing. Where is there maybe blockers to external data sharing? Are those legal blockers? Are those cultural blockers? Are those privacy blockers? Or are they technology blockers? And essentially, based on that internal diagnosis, I would figure out my strategy. How I had to do it in San Francisco, some of the biggest blockers, there were 2 primary blockers to open data sort of moving to the next stage, to a mature, fully operational program in San Francisco. One was just lack of clarity around what was expected and doing the right thing. And so that was easy to fix. The biggest barrier was cultural and a reluctance to share data, and it's sort of an annoyance that this was on a non-funded mandate. And so one of the most important things that we did around the open data, external data sharing play there was we diagnosed that reluctance. And instead of sort of, being like, oh my gosh, if we just share our data, external developers will do magical things with our data and it's going to transform San Francisco. Instead of that messaging, we said, hey, you know what? It's really hard to share data inside our city and county, right? If you're in a different department, even within departments. And so what we said was, we're like, actually, this external data sharing move is really great for internal data sharing moves. So it's going to actually meet both value propositions. So by sort of inverting the external promise into an internal and an external promise, it really helped gain business support and value for it. And then a few other key things we did. We made, as we introduced trainings and capacity building and data literacy skills, we would integrate the external data sharing as our use cases, our examples, all of that, and then we would showcase projects. So we introduced at Data and Innovation Awards, where one of our featured projects was around open data. So we incented and showcased it as something that's great to be done. On the cybersecurity side of things, I think again, same diagnosis. What is the business drivers behind external sharing? Why do we need to do it? What are all the limitations? And then based on that diagnosis, I think for us in the company I used to work for, CoreLight, which is a startup cybersecurity company, what was so interesting about the product that we offered is that we essentially provided companies with a tool of gathering their data, but actually the data stayed with them. Instead, what we focused on as a service provider is making sure that when they bought our product, they could pull that data out and put it into any platform and piece that they need. So I think something on the private sector side, if it's an external data sharing play, being very API first in terms of how you make that data available in well-documented APIs. And I think since I'm in the IT shop, I would very much focus on that API first strategy without knowing too much about this business we're talking about, but a very much API first strategy and really focusing on that data liquidity, along with then a precision access control framework on top of it. So those are sort of the things that I would be really focused on. I'll kick it over to Kamayini, unless we jump to the next section.
No, I'm going to ask a follow-up question, but I'm going to direct it to Kamayini. So Kamayini, I'm curious about how you find the right partners. So let's say we're not making the data publicly available. It's not necessarily open data. It's not necessarily for transparency. Maybe it's more partnerships. It could be, for example, nonprofit partnerships or even for-profit partnerships. How do you find the right organizations to share data with? Because at the end of the day, as an organization, this new spinoff, we need to, generate revenue, of course. And so there will be, we do want to generate something from this data, be it IP or whatnot. But we can't just give data to anyone, right? Otherwise, if we have to make it open, for example, it may not be granular enough. So what are your suggestions for finding the right partners, someone we can trust, or organizations in general? How would you tackle that?
Yeah, I think, look, what I would say is, when you're going to do external data sharing, agnostic of whether you were doing public or you were doing for-profit partnerships, right? You have to answer both sides of the equation. Where is the value creation? How much of the value am I going to keep as a company versus what I'm going to give away to my partner in this process? And then where is the risk component of exchanging this data? And how do I mitigate the risk through the right people, process, technology enablement, such that the risk is commensurate with both the partners' risk appetite, right? Anytime you share data, there is an inherent amount of risk. And especially if I take the context or lens of, an industry that I've almost spent 15 years in, which is healthcare, it's very sensitive personal health information and protected health information of humans. And so for those types of data sets, in fact, sometimes you're going to want to pivot to secure the risk dimension and equation first and say, if I exchange this data with a given partner, what's their level of understanding of health data? Do they have the right receiving mechanisms? Do they have the right environments that we would consider sharing a reputational exposure along with this partner, right? So depending on the type of data, the type of industry, you have to potentially focus on that risk equation before you even worry about the value equation. And then from a value equation perspective, and if I take this example in a healthcare context, the value can be created as a point-to-point value exchange of data. So for example, I may, in a commercial alliance, want to exchange my data for a product launch as Pharma A with a distribution partner in Pharma B that has reach in a given geography or market. That's fine and dandy. But alternatively, in this case of our spinoff, right? Let's say this was a spinoff that had really rich, and I'm going to contextualize this to continuing example with healthcare and patient data. we may want to basically take this data set and make it available more broadly beyond just the context of one pharma in a given market. I might want to compete with and make this competitively available to multiple pharmas or multiple provider site contexts. And in which case, my partner choices are going to be more driving towards an intermediate aggregator that can feed a broader ecosystem and market. So those are some of the considerations that I would consider in saying, okay, which partner do we go with? But also remember that, at the end of the day, in the context of our spin-off example, if the spin-off is truly about a data play, the value is the envelope we're trying to push with this spin-off. We have to walk in very clear about which partners are going to sort of the proverbial grow the pie or the value of the data that we have, versus restrict it into a singular exchange of data, depending on the partner you pick. That's what I'd probably add to that, Luke.
Excellent, excellent. So we've touched on a few things that I think would be good to get to next, but I have one follow-up question on this point. And it can be either Joy or Kamayini in this case, whoever wants to jump in, but I'm wondering, and this is something I learned myself when, for example, I was considering laser eye surgery. They say, you want to check with the doctor and make sure they've had experience with things that have gone wrong. So have you, thinking of data sharing, thinking of this external data sharing, have you seen any examples where things could go wrong? And what have you learned from that would be worth considering as we pursue this initiative?
I think I see Joey trying to get a word in. So I was going to say that, I don't know, Luke, if I've necessarily seen things go wrong purposefully or intentionally. But I think I've seen a lot of things go wrong accidentally, right? And without giving away significant details. This is during COVID, hyper uptake in cyber activity incident, data breach, personal data, not the company in concern, but a third party, right? And the third party's handling of data, which was inadequate, proven, targeted, possibly country state agent initiated cyber attack during the time of COVID vaccines coming down the pike, and intellectual property being infringed through the or intentional phishing for intellectual property through the cyber attacks that were coming. When things go wrong, they can go very wrong. And by the way, that everything you could have conceived of in terms of a New York Times press coverage spotlight, that happened too. And so what we ended up having to do in that scenario was really, trying to cover our bases in terms of very quickly invoking a complete, I call it incident response to privacy exposure to how many different patient data that we had that was exposed in that scenario. So without more specifics, we did remediate, but it did end up in a material disclosure to a data protection authority in 2 countries in EU, okay? So that's one kind of issue that will happen more often than not, and will not be for lack of planning or lack of building in the right safeguards. It's just, the way the cyber world rolls today. And I'm sure Joy can add more stories and color to that. But that's the one that came to me top of mind. Joy, let me see if you had more to add.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think the world of data protection is pretty well established, right? We have, pick your industry standard that you want to follow, from government sponsored ones to, sort of where open consensus, NIST to ISO, right? Data privacy standards is still an emerging field, and it's sort of in flux because, we have, in California, for example, not California, but in the United States, we have some rules from HIPAA, right? We have a variety of like rules frameworks out there, but I do think there's a broader trust framework to be developed around external data sharing when private data is implied. Whether that's a strategic partner, whether it's like predictable anonymization tools. I mean, what has been so tricky about the external data sharing space and the intersection of privacy when you're talking about personal data is that the sort of, the chips on the board keep changing, right? And so, so in government, when we publish open data, we have an obligation to be transparent, yet we also have an obligation to protect individually identifiable data. And navigating that is a tricky balance. And while we develop toolkits and things like that to support that work, and we've seen lots of places where, despite people's best thinking, you can reverse engineer it and re-identify people. And so I think we're kind of still figuring this out. And I think ultimately that's why in the private sector, you're going to still see hesitancy around data sharing. And of course, you'll do your data protection stuff. You'll do all that good stuff. You'll have sort of contractual controls in place. But I think the reality is this is a discipline that's still evolving and developing as we speak.
Yeah. And look, the other thing that I've seen go wrong, and I can probably rest after that, is this is more indexed on the value play, not so much the data risk exposure play. And this was not, we hadn't fully marched the walk on a full-blown partnership yet, but very quickly during the conversations of exploring the value piece and which partner in the engagement was going to capture how much of the value, it became very apparent that there was an intentional design on account of the partner we were trying to explore an ongoing relationship for their provider side data sets, that their intention was to go ahead and sell that as a asset to other players in industry. And that quickly, very quickly dissipated the value play for us in the partnership. So I think that that's more likely a scenario than, you get into a partnership and then things devolve from there. That's typically not what I've noticed. But again, I'm sure as more data monetization use cases come forward, there will be things that will go wrong in terms of fair market value of data assets that are being exchanged. But can't speak to specific examples at the moment, at least in healthcare today. Data aggregators in healthcare, probably there are lots of examples from the likes of, patient registry firms and data aggregators in healthcare, like IQVIA, actually, like Privacy Analytics parent company, that I'm sure has some such scenarios playing out even today.
Excellent, thank you. I think this is a great segue, and I'll let Sarah pick up maybe the next decision point.
Okay, fantastic. So again, audience, you'll have the opportunity to weigh in to where you'd like this narrative to go. And the next decision point here is our CDO today will only have the internal capital to invest in culture or technology at this time. Really can't do both. So you're going to have to pick between investment in culture or technology. You can put culture or technology into the chat, and we're going to take the route that comes in most popular. And we'll give it maybe a couple seconds because I think there is a little bit of a lag from when we see the entries to the chat.
Yeah. And a reminder, we do have questions, Q&A coming in, but we will have time at the end to go over those as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we have already heard both culture and elements of technology come up in the conversation. It's looking like culture is the one that people want to see investment in. So maybe a question for Joy to kick us off, given that you're going to be investing in culture, how are you going to make data sharing a success?
Yeah, so I think, first off, I'm glad people respond that way. Cultural investments are cheaper than technology investments. And even if you've got no budget for culture, as a CDO or a data leader, you need to spend your sort of mental time and staff time on culture. So I'll just sort of note that. So I think there's a couple different plays that I've certainly made, and I'll sort of offer them up as a menu of cultural plays. So I mentioned one of these already. We did a variety of things around data awards and recognition where we really highlighted the sort of behavior we wanted to incent. So if sharing was one of those, have a periodic awards ceremony around like best data sharing initiatives across the company and highlight them and feature them and get them in front of their leaders. I also talked around Data Academy. It was our internal data sharing academy. We would base Data Academy and all the trainings we would do to build data literacy. We would base them off of sort of demand, but we would also lead with what we thought people should be doing, right? And so offering classes that sort of allow people to build up that muscle. Since you're in IT, you want to then weave that with the tools you want them to use. So the training plus the tools that you've already made an investment in. Another thing that we would do is a lot of times as data leaders, when you're trying to introduce new data initiatives, you find yourselves in pitch mode. You're trying to pitch people on doing this, like, oh, maybe, come on, guys, this is such a good idea. This is so exciting. A play that we've done around culture and cultural change is inverting that power dynamic of, instead of being like the data beggar asking people to do delicious data things, we instead said, hey, we're going to do this thing. If you want to do it, you have to apply to work with us, right? And so when you invert that power dynamic, you actually get to set the terms of the engagement. And this can be super, super powerful way of changing cultural behavior. So for example, when we introduced data science as a service, which by the way was a very low cost investment, instead of asking people like, hey, please work with us, we went around and we demonstrated what we thought we could do. I'm not going to talk about the project topology because I talked about that another time, but maybe I can. But it was essentially a method we developed to help businesses opportunity spot data science projects. But then we said, hey, if you guys want to work with us, so we essentially did a marketing outreach campaign, and then we made them apply. And departments who wouldn't give us like the time of day before we did that, where we'd be just begging them to get on their calendars, suddenly they became some of our most favored clients. And then what we did was, lo and behold, we then had a demo day where we showcased all of our partner and client projects. And not only did we do a demo day where we sort of featured our clients front and center, we wrote them up in little short form articles, and we got client testimonials. So you can use all these these cultural aspects to really sort of hack the behavior of your potential partners. And I'll sort of maybe share one last anecdote, which is that you can do on the cultural side of things to really, we can sort of present the ROI, the business case. All those arguments are good and they're good for intellectually, but I think intellectually convincing people, but I think cultivating really salient lived experiences for your partners that really embeds in them the need for that data sharing or that data science play or that data quality piece. And sometimes it can be quite easy. So one example we did was we wanted to reimagine how data sharing worked in the city and county of San Francisco. And so what we did was, and I had department heads, like very, powerful people, and I split them into groups. I made them sit at tables with like markers and like paper. And I gave them a new identity. So I gave each group a new identity. You are no longer the head of this department. This is your new identity. You guys are, you're working, and I actually picked several different companies, right? And I redid the San Francisco logo in the logo of the company. And now I want you guys to brainstorm, and you have to present back to the group your new vision of data sharing, because this is your company. This is how this company is going to approach it. And that was a really generative experience that created so many awesome ideas that we actually incorporated into the data sharing playbooks that we then introduced in the city. And so really, it's, there's and this is, if you're more interested in these approaches, I highly recommend a book called Moments of Impact, How to Design Strategic Conversations. And in that book, they talk about how it's very hard to just be like, think outside of the box, right? Like people are like, what does that mean? You know, and so part of this exercise was giving them a different box to think in. And so sometimes giving people a different box as opposed to just telling them to think out of the box can be a way of jarring the sort of the cultural mindsets that sort of can become ossified as you sit in that cultural space over time.
Yeah. Thank you, Joy, and thank you for the menu of different techniques that you've used in the past and the stories to go along with them. This all sounds very good for the company, but maybe a question for Kamayini: as these investments in culture are being made, at a certain point, will you not have a technology deficit, and how will you deal with that from a credibility and momentum standpoint, reporting in through the IT organization?
Yeah, and there's no denying that there will be a lag in technology that needs to follow. But my humble experience, having done this in 2 different industries, the technology gap can be very quickly compressed and leapfrogged, especially today, where there is intelligent solutions for catalogs to governance tools to data lakes in a box and industry fit for purpose data lakes in a box, right, and lake houses in a box. So I think the way I would buy us time, right, reporting in through the CIO, which is where we pegged ourselves, is to say that, look, data sharing, right, is intrinsically a human behaviors and emotion problem, and less so a technology problem. If you get ahead with driving the right ways of working, building that muscle memory through the enterprise at large, that will eventually organically bring about a demand, prioritization, and a commensurate investment behind it, right? And then you won't be selling it. You won't be trying to justify an investment envelope. By the way, the investment envelope on building these types of data sharing ecosystems, especially externally focused data sharing ecosystems, is not an inexpensive proposition. So I think this is where I think, my answer to my senior leader that I report in through and the board would be, give us the time to get the humans aligned, which is the hardest piece of the puzzle. Of course, I was very glad, just like Joy, to hear that that's where the audience went as well, because that's actually the harder and the longer tail piece to solve for, right? And in fact, I was going to throw on 2 additional things that we've done from a menu of tools and tools in your toolkit that you can toy around with. Is I've worked in many manufacturing domains, both in medical devices and in pharma. Any kind of manufacturing context, because of the focus on environment, health, and employee safety in manufacturing context. Maybe some of you are accustomed to this notion of any company that has a large internal manufacturing presence. They start with this notion of and manufacturing site heads will normally start any opening meeting with a safety moment. So one of the things we did was, and because we are, at least in CSL, we're a very manufacturing heavy, internal manufacturing heavy company, we did a spin on the safety moment. So instead of opening with a safety moment, we now open most meetings with a data moment, just to start to get our senior executives to start to talk about what data did they use, what data wasn't there and they wanted it at their fingertips. And that then does start sort of this organic trickle-down effect from the top down of a leadership that's trying to act, being data-driven, versus a data organization trying to sell them on why they need to be data-driven, right? And then the second one I'll throw on there is to build into Joy's point about reverse the power play angle. We created in a recent past life a career track out of data and analytics, and in fact position that career track in the enterprise as the budding leaders of P&L and or functional business units of the future. And that sort of started to organically trend the historically non-data oriented people, laggards in the organization, as well as functions to start to say, hey, maybe there's something to this. If the future of a leadership role is being data literate and data educated and data driven, maybe I need to jump on that bandwagon. So, I mean, those are some of the ways that I would probably also explore additional tools in your toolkit as CDOs, probably running into similar conversations as we are in this hypothetical board scenario. And on the technology, Sarah, don't get me wrong, it needs to catch up, but the catch up and the time to catch up has only exponentially gone down in the last 5 years.
Thank you, Kamayini. And so I think we do want to get to, there have been some questions that have come in, and I think we want to give an opportunity for the audience to ask some questions of Joy and Kamayini. Maybe before we do that though, we've had this adventure experience that has played out with our CDOs. Maybe just a moment of reflection before we jump to audience questions, just on this experience, which was really to play a part, to tell a story. So maybe to kick off, Joy, any reflections before we go to the audience for questions?
Sure. I think, sorry, one second. Yeah, I think some reflections and is just building on what Kamayini said. I do think with data, culture is king, right? And I do think, and also agree, like the technology stuff, that's so easy, right? And there's actually there's a annual report that's done by, I think it's called New Vanguard, and every year they survey about 70 to 100 companies, and the persistent response is that only 25% report being data driven, and some 70% say that it's hard to get business to see the business opportunity in data. And that's really been consistent over time. And a lot of these are legacy companies, and I always joke that government's the biggest legacy company of all time. And so my sort of high level reflection is if you don't focus on the cultural piece, you won't get there. And how you get to the cultural piece at its heart, I actually have different strategies for different layers of the org, right? You want a very different strategy with your executives and your business leaders versus your managers, your supervisors, versus your IT staff versus your data staff, right? And so you actually want a different sort of cultural engagement piece. You know, for example, where we focus on with our data teams is, it's all about connective tissue and unblocking their own capacity, right? They don't need, and then sort of giving them skills to talk and speak with leadership. So I just think at its heart, it's about that. And the other piece of that heart is important business questions. So all these, you know, we had these, you know, various this versus this, data quality versus business needs. Well, no, it's business needs, and then if there's a data quality issue, all the more reason to focus on that data quality issue. For example, you know, we're working on developing a set of models on how to predict recidivism of people experiencing homelessness into the emergency room. The data sets were, you know, there were, you know, coming from EMR system, coming from all sorts of different systems. There were huge gaps in the data quality. That didn't stop us from building a model. What it meant was that we spent a lot more time in exploratory analysis, understanding the data quality issues, making sure that we didn't make bad choices about our features and our parameters. And we did that with the business owner to answer a question that the business cared about, right? And so the culture change at its heart is about helping the business answer their questions, or if they're struggling to ask the right questions, your job is to help them learn how to ask the right questions. And I've talked about that in other forums, so I won't talk about it here. So I'll leave with that thought.
Thank you, Joy. And Kamayini, any reflections from you before we go to audience questions?
No, I think the one, in summary, I think perspective I'll share is that, you know, data sharing and data strategy, right, there's more to data strategy of a company than just data sharing. Yes, sharing creates inherently more value, both internally and externally through your partner and collaborator ecosystem. But give that some thought. Your data strategy should include sharing as one of the many chapters of your data strategy for the company, because some of your data strategy may need to focus on beyond the sharing issues. You may be lacking data, both internally and externally in an external landscape and ecosystem, and where you might have to engage in primary data generation. So, for all of the CDO conversation today, in the scenario that we were in hypothetically, if we were focusing exclusively on data sharing, just don't forget about that your data strategy is a little bit broader than just that sharing focus.
Thank you very much, Kamayini, and really good point. We zeroed in right away on data sharing today. So thank you for stepping back and having the reflection for our audience. We actually have a question with several votes that's come in. And the question is, what are the key elements that you recommend in building a data sharing framework? So I'll open it to both of you, whoever wants to take the question about building a data sharing framework.
So I can warm us up. I mean, I think the first and foremost lesson that I've learned through two industry lenses is taking a principles-based approach, right? Try to maximize data sharing and build sort of a guardrail, and explicitly state when you hit a guardrail, must you now start to invoke a data governance forum or a mechanism to arbitrate whether or not that data is shareable. So generally speaking, all data, and definitely in an internal enterprise context, should be assumed as 100% shareable, unless it's personal data, protected data, health data, or sensitive, employee, HR, and such data. The guardrails for internal data should be fairly low, right? And should be, privileged access for these types of sensitive data sets that I talked about. When it comes to external, a similar maximal sharing mechanism should be invoked. However, the guardrails need to go up a little bit, right? The hurdle you want to raise for external data sharing and the guardrail, barriers need to be higher. So that's on the, a principles-based approach, a framework that generally maximizes sharing, while laying out an explicit set of guardrails that anybody in the enterprise can use to sort of then explicitly take only exception cases by guardrails back for an arbitration review by the appropriate governing bodies, whether data governance bodies or other internal committees and councils that might exist in the context of an enterprise. That said, Joy, you might have a perspective here on the open data sharing that took hold in your tenure in government. And of course, by the way, open data became the way that all of the candidate diagnostics and therapeutics through the COVID pandemic came about. So perhaps there's more to your lens there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with like the non-public data sharing though, because that's always honestly been the harder nugget in government. And I like to give a little, and well, I won't do it here, but a lot of people are, whoa, GDPR and oh, CCPA. And I'm just like, oh, I have a slide deck that I used to give on privacy and open data, where I would just sort of list all the federal laws around data sharing that we work under. And then I would list all the ones that I know of in the state of California, which are often analogous to the federal ones, but just a little bit different in terms of their definitions, just to make data sharing extra fun and complex. And then when I was in San Francisco, we had local versions. So I was just like, we don't operate under one data. It's a forest of data sharing regimes, right? So, but I'll sort of share my 3-part play for internal data sharing, which is one, you need executive support and mandate. It's just, especially in the government world, the legal complexity and the perceptions around risk are so huge that you really need the executive support to highlight the business value and to lift the business value to be considered in the context with it. So that's one. I think number two is what I call process as a safety blanket, right? You don't want data sharing to happen willy-nilly. You actually want standard, repeatable, consistent procedures that people feel secure in, that if they're following them, they at least know they did it the right way. And so, and of course, offer training around that. So we just this month launched our interagency data exchange guidebook, and that guidebook, of course, it references, we have an umbrella, single MOU umbrella with all of our privacy and security terms addressed, but then it's just designed to support you through the way. There's cute little like charts and graphs. There's, you know, templates on how to initiate a data exchange with a partner. Like here's email template, you know, just really trying to reduce that organizational friction through standard shared approaches. I'll contrast this. In San Francisco, we are trying to move towards that, but every time there was a data sharing agreement, and it was like a brand new novel thing, right? We weren't building off of standard shared things. So standard shared processes as safety blankets. And then the last piece is a technology piece, which is like, you want to make that that last step of data exchange, but also data revocation. You want to like build out those technical tools. And as Kamayini already has noted, I am so excited to be a laggard in government because we can leapfrog all the like bad old ways of doing this and just move to modern, awesome, fast, well-priced, transparently priced systems. So I'm personally just thrilled with that state for us and on the government side of things.
Thank you, Joy. We've had another question come in, and I realize we only have a couple minutes in the session, but the question is about tips or tricks for communicating new data or reports to internal stakeholders who may not be entirely engaged with data development. Now, I realize with only a couple minutes here, we probably don't have a lot of time to dive deep into some of the questions, but we did actually have a workshop yesterday where Joy and Kamayini shared several tips and tricks. So if anybody is interested who missed it in that session and the recording, I don't know, Luke, if there's a way to maybe share your email address, because that's additionally an option to maybe elaborate a little bit further. There were a lot of tips and tricks regarding communication and bringing people along a journey. I don't know if either one of you wants to tackle it very quickly to wrap up today's session, but just on the communication side of things for stakeholders who aren't as engaged, how you really communicate new capabilities, reports, data for those less engaged.
Yeah, Sarah, I can wrap this up fairly quickly to summarize. You know, almost all of the tools in the toolkit that Joy and I articulated for the culture aspect, right, become channels for you to communicate. You know, your new data development, your new analytic product and services that you might be building, but are not well known to the organization internally and externally to your collaborators. So think about each of those tools, but also additionally, you know, humans generally tend to listen to a lot of word of mouth, right? And this is where I think if you can find your change agents that you recruited in that first step of who are your business advisors to the CDO organization or the CDAO organization, and make sure that your data stories get out to them. And they then become the advocates and sort of word of mouth referral and awareness creators in the organization. So I think those are the two big ones that I would summarize that answer to be.
I love it. Thank you so much, Kamayini. And thank you to everybody for participating today and for helping us shape this story and the adventure for our CDOs.
And thank you, Sarah, for such a really interesting session. We had actually everybody did get on board with the chats, and you guys will get some direction in there, and that was good. Maybe we can try that one again. It's always interesting when Privacy Analytics puts on an event like this one. We've had several of them, and we've enjoyed each one. They've been a different flavor all the way through. Thank you for bringing in Kamayini and Joy on this one as well. They were terrific, and we actually have exactly 5 minutes to the next session. So thank you again. You guys can take a look at this later on. around. You guys will get all the questions if you ask for them, and we will adjourn real quick and move to the next session then. But thank you so much.